August 16, 1944, Chartres, France. The war is not yet over, but the Germans have left this city and the Americans are here, and the streets are full of people who have waited 4 years for exactly this moment. The celebrations are genuine. The relief is real. People are crying and laughing and embracing soldiers they have never met because those soldiers represent the end of something that has felt endless. And then, in the middle of the celebration, a different kind of crowd forms in the town square. A young woman is brought out. She is 23 years old. Her name is Simone Tussaud. She is carrying an infant in her arms, a baby whose father is a German soldier. 2 men hold her wrists. A third man grabs a handful of her hair. The scissors come out. The crowd watches. Some are silent, some are shouting, some are laughing. The scissors cut and cut and cut until Simone Tussaud's head is bare, her scalp visible in the August sunlight, her infant daughter watching from the crook of her arm with the incomprehension of a child who does not yet understand what is happening to her mother. It is not over. After the scissors, a red-hot iron is brought out. The letter O is branded onto her forehead. Not as a legal marking, not by order of any court, not by any authority that has reviewed any evidence. By a crowd in a public square on a warm afternoon in August 1944, because this woman had worked as a translator for the German occupiers and had been in a relationship with a German soldier since 1941. She was accused of denouncing neighbors who were subsequently deported. She denied it. No trial was held that day. There was no judge, no defense, no rules of evidence, no appeal. There was only the crowd and the scissors and the iron and the infant watching from her mother's arms. A photographer named Robert Capa was there. He took a photograph that has become one of the most famous images of the entire liberation of France. Simone Tussaud, head shaved, infant daughter in her arms, the crowd visible behind her, her expression capturing something that does not have a simple name. Not shame exactly, not defiance. Something between them. Something that looks like a person trying to remain a person while the people around her are doing their best to make sure she doesn't feel like one anymore. This photograph is the starting point. But what Simone Tussaud experienced was not an isolated incident. It was not even among the worst of what happened across occupied Europe in the months and years following liberation. And the story of what was done to women accused of sleeping with German soldiers across France and Norway and the Netherlands and Belgium and Denmark and beyond is a story that the history of the Second World War has spent 80 years either ignoring, minimizing, or framing in ways that make it easier to absorb and harder to honestly examine. And if you believe that the truth of what happened to ordinary women caught in the machine of occupation and then in the machine of liberation deserves to be told in full, subscribe right now, because that is exactly what this video does. This is the story of what happened to the women who slept with the enemy. To understand what happened to these women, you need to understand what occupation actually felt like from the inside. Not the version of occupation that appears in films, where the resistance is clear and heroic, and the collaboration is clearly venal and cowardly. The reality of occupation is messier, because the reality of any situation in which a foreign military force takes over your country and remains there for 4 or 5 years is that life continues. People still need to eat. They still need work. They still need warmth and human contact and the things that make existence bearable. And the occupying force is made up of human beings who also need those things, who have money to spend, who have time to fill, who are in many cases young men far from home looking for connection in the same way that young men have always looked for connection. France fell to Germany in June 1940. Within weeks, more than 1 million German soldiers were stationed across French territory. They were not a distant presence. They were in the cafes, the markets, the streets, the workplaces. French women interacted with German soldiers every day of the occupation, not because they chose to, but because the occupation was the condition of their lives. Some of those interactions were purely practical. A German soldier stopped a woman on the street and asked for directions. A woman sold bread to a German at her shop. A woman cleaned the offices where German administrators worked because it was the job that was available. Others went further. Some French women genuinely fell in love with German soldiers. Some had relationships that began out of economic necessity because a German boyfriend meant access to food, to protection, to resources that were desperately scarce in occupied France. Some were coerced, some were raped and had no choice at all, and some were genuine ideological collaborators who actively aided the occupation and did real damage to real people. When liberation came, these categories collapsed into one. The women got the scissors. Historian Fabrice Virgili, who wrote the foundational scholarly account of this phenomenon, documented approximately 20,000 cases of women having their heads shaved across France between 1943 and the beginning of 1946. 20,000. That number includes women in all of the categories above, from the woman who genuinely betrayed her neighbors to the Gestapo, to the woman who had a German customer at her bakery, to the woman who was raped, to the woman who fell in love. The scissors did not distinguish. The crowd did not ask for a thorough accounting of the evidence before it acted. They called it the épuration sauvage, the wild purge. The name is descriptive. It was spontaneous, it was unofficial, it had no legal basis. It was carried out in town squares and village streets and city courtyards across France in the weeks and months after liberation, conducted by crowds that ranged from genuine resistance fighters who had spent years risking their lives against the occupation, to men who had spent those years doing nothing but watched an opportunity for violence arrive on the back of liberation and seized it. And the targets were almost exclusively women. The procedure, where there was one, followed a rough pattern. A woman was identified, or accused, or simply pointed out by someone in the crowd who claimed to know something about her. She was seized. She was brought to a public space. Her head was shaved, usually by someone with scissors or clippers, sometimes with a straight razor, done quickly and not gently, in front of whatever audience had gathered. Then she was paraded. Through the streets, through the crowd, the jeering, the spitting, the shouting. Some women were stripped half-naked first. Some had tar poured over them and swastikas painted on their bodies. Some were made to give the Nazi salute. Some were beaten. In Paris, in the 18th arrondissement, a woman who had worked as a prostitute serving German clients was kicked to death by the crowd. In some regions, there are records of women being tortured before the public humiliation. In some cases, the humiliation ended with imprisonment. In some cases, it ended with execution. The total number of people killed in France during the épuration sauvage, not just the women, but including all the summary executions of suspected collaborators, is estimated at somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000. The exact number is impossible to establish because many of the killings were not recorded by any authority that kept records. And all of it happened before most of these women had been given any opportunity to present any evidence in their own defense, before any court had reviewed the accusations, before any standard of proof had been applied to any claim made by any person in any crowd. In the working-class Paris neighborhood where the prostitute was kicked to death, no one established first that she had chosen her German clients out of collaboration rather than being in the only profession available to her that had paying customers. In the village squares where the scissors came out, no one established first whether the woman had been in a relationship out of love, out of fear, out of economic desperation, or out of genuine ideological sympathy. The crowd gathered. The verdict had already been reached. The punishment was simply the implementation of a decision that required no evidence to support it. There is a specific cruelty in head shaving that goes beyond the physical act, which is itself not painful in the way that a beating is painful. Fabrice Virgili's analysis of why this punishment was chosen, rather than any of the other forms of public humiliation that were available, identifies several layers. Hair is deeply connected to feminine identity, to attractiveness, to the social legibility of women in a way that it is not for men. Shaving a woman's head in public is an act that targets specifically her femininity, that removes a marker of her gender, that makes her visually legible as someone who has violated something about being a woman, rather than simply having committed an act that anyone might commit. It is a sexualized punishment. It says that what she did wrong was something she did with her body, with her sexuality, with the specifically female aspect of herself. It says that her crime was a female crime, and it marks her in a way that lasts. A shaved head takes months to grow back. Every day of those months, the woman who has been shaved carries the visible evidence of what the crowd decided about her on the day it seized her and put the scissors to her head. The crowds were mostly men. This is documented in the photographs. The people who held the scissors, who poured the tar, who painted the swastikas, who led the parading, who shouted the insults and did the spitting and the kicking were overwhelmingly male. And men who had collaborated with the German occupation, who had provided supplies, intelligence, labor, administrative service to the occupiers, who had benefited economically from the relationship with the German authorities in ways that extended far beyond anything most of the women who lost their hair had done, were not treated this way. Male collaborators faced official courts. Some were executed by firing squad after legal proceedings. Some were imprisoned. Some fled. Very few were stripped in public squares and shaved and paraded. The public, physical, visible punishment for complicity with the occupation fell almost entirely on women, and it fell on them for the specifically female form of complicity, which is sexual contact, while the substantive economic and political collaboration that men conducted was processed by courts or simply not processed at all. This disproportion was noticed at the time and commented on at the time. The writer Simone de Beauvoir, who was in Paris during the Liberation, observed that there was something profoundly unfair about a purge that directed its most visible and most brutal energy at women who had slept with German soldiers while leaving largely intact the businessmen who had made fortunes supplying the German military and the officials who had administered the occupation with efficiency and apparent loyalty. De Beauvoir was not alone in noticing this. The mismatch between the scale and intensity of the punishment visited on women and the relative immunity of many male collaborators was visible to anyone who looked at what was happening without the emotional investment of being part of the crowd that was doing it. What was driving the crowd was not primarily a moral calculation about who had done the most damage to France. It was something else. Something about shame and masculinity and the specific wound that military occupation inflicts on the men of the occupied country, which is the wound of helplessness. For 4 years, French men had been unable to protect their country, unable to protect their families, unable to project the military power and the masculine authority that the culture told them was their function and their identity. The Germans were there. The Germans were in charge. And French women were, in some cases, sleeping with the Germans. The image of the French woman in the arms of the German soldier was an image of everything the French man could not bear about the occupation, concentrated into the most intimate possible form of defeat. When the Germans left and the opportunity for retribution arrived, that image was what the crowd came for. The scissors were as much about restoring a certain idea of French masculine honor as they were about punishing collaboration. The women's heads were shaved because their bodies had become the site where the humiliation of France had been most viscerally, most personally, most unavoidably experienced by the men who were now holding the scissors. The woman who had no choice at all, the woman who had been coerced or raped, the woman who had worked as a cleaner in a German-occupied building because there was no other work available, was not protected from this crowd by her innocence. She was not protected by anything. The accusation was enough. Someone in the village said she had been seen talking to a German soldier. Someone on the street said she had taken food from an occupier. Someone with a personal grievance saw in the liberation an opportunity to settle a score that had nothing to do with the occupation and everything to do with a dispute over money or property or a romantic rivalry that predated the war entirely. Historians have documented cases in which women were shaved and paraded on the basis of accusations made by neighbors who hated them and saw the épuration sauvage as a mechanism for destroying someone they had wanted to destroy for years. The accusation cost the accuser nothing. The woman who was accused lost everything. Some of the women had, in fact, collaborated in ways that caused specific and serious harm. They had denounced members of the French resistance to the Gestapo. They had provided intelligence that led to arrests, deportations, deaths. They had used their proximity to the German authorities to make themselves powerful in occupied France in ways that depended on and perpetuated the occupation. These women existed. Their crimes were real and in some cases severe. But the épuration sauvage could not distinguish them from the funeral wreath maker in Toulouse, who had a German soldier stop at her open window one afternoon and talk to her for 5 minutes. Both of them faced the same crowd. Both of them got the scissors. The crowd was not interested in evidence. The children were perhaps the most complete victims of all of this. Relations between French women and German soldiers produced an estimated 200,000 children. 200,000 human beings born into a world that, from the moment of their birth, had decided they were an offense. Most of them grew up not knowing who their fathers were. Their mothers, if they survived the epuration and rebuilt their lives, did not talk about it. The shame was too complete, the social cost of the admission too high, the hatred that the child's German parentage would attract too dangerous. Many of these children discovered their origins only after their mothers died, going through letters and photographs from the war years, finding evidence of a relationship that had been hidden so thoroughly that decades of family life had been constructed on top of it. The discovery that you are the child of a German soldier, that the war produced you, that your existence is evidence of something your mother was punished for, is not a discovery that resolves cleanly into any comfortable understanding of who you are. In Norway, the story of what happened to the women who had relationships with German soldiers followed a different institutional path, but arrived at many of the same destinations. Norway was invaded by Germany on April 9, 1940. It was a neutral country, and it was taken by force, its government fleeing to London to form a government in exile, while the Wehrmacht occupied the country with approximately 300,000 German soldiers. When you have 300,000 soldiers occupying a country of roughly 3 million people, there is no version of reality in which those soldiers and the civilian population do not interact in every dimension of daily life. And Heinrich Himmler, the SS chief who was obsessed with the project of building an Aryan master race, had a particular interest in Norway. He considered Norwegian women ideal genetic material. He encouraged his soldiers to have relationships with Norwegian women. He set up the first Lebensborn reproduction center outside Germany in Norway in 1941, a network of maternity facilities designed to support and legitimize pregnancies resulting from relations between Norwegian women and German soldiers, to bring those children into the SS family as pure-blooded Aryans who would populate the future racial state. An estimated 30,000 to 50,000 Norwegian women had intimate relationships with German soldiers during the 5 years of occupation. They were called, at the time and after, the Tiskerpiker, the German girls, or more aggressively, Tiskerhor, German whores. The second term was not used ironically or reluctantly. It was used with the full force of contempt that the word is designed to convey, to strip the woman of any complexity, any individual circumstance, any recognition that her situation might have been more complicated than the label allowed. When Norway was liberated in May 1945, the Norwegian government, which returned from London with the moral authority of 5 years of exile resistance, faced the question of what to do about collaboration. And the answer for the Tiskerpiker was not head-shaving in public squares. It was something with more institutional gravity, something that looked, from the outside, like it had the backing of law and procedure, while in its actual operation being almost as arbitrary and almost as unjust as anything that happened in a French village in August 1944. At least 5,000 Norwegian women were interned in approximately 20 internment camps across Norway for periods of up to 120 days. They were held without trial. They were held without being charged with any crime, because having a relationship with a German soldier was not, in fact, illegal under Norwegian law. Not before the war, not during the war, not after the war. The Norwegian legal code contained no provision that made intimate relations with an enemy soldier a criminal offense. The women were held anyway. The legal mechanism used to justify the internment was a medical one, a provision allowing for the detention of people suspected of carrying sexually transmitted diseases who posed a public health risk. The women were presumed to be infected. The internment was framed as preventive medicine rather than punishment. It was, in practice, punishment. And the Norwegian government, which returned from London proud of its commitment to the rule of law and the principles of democratic governance, carried it out anyway, because the political cost of treating the Tiskerpiker with the due process they were legally entitled to was judged to be too high. Women who had married German soldiers lost their Norwegian citizenship entirely and were deported to Germany, often with their children, to a country that had just lost a catastrophic war and was now under Allied occupation and dealing with the complete collapse of its own social and economic structure. They were expelled from Norway, stripped of their nationality, and sent to a country that was not their own, that did not want them, that associated them with the regime that had just been destroyed. Some of them were teenagers. The Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg, when Norway formally apologized to these women in 2018, acknowledged that for many of them, this was just a teenage love, that for some it was the love of their lives with an enemy soldier, that for others it was an innocent flirtation that was allowed to mark and define the rest of their lives. The apology came in 2018. That is 73 years after the internment began. Most of the women who were interned were dead by the time their government said it was sorry. The children born of Norwegian women and German soldiers had their own trajectory of suffering that ran parallel to their mothers, but was in some ways worse because it was longer. There were approximately 10,000 to 12,000 Lebensborn children born in Norway. Some were taken from their mothers entirely, placed in foster homes, given new names, told nothing of their origins. Some were placed in institutions that were specifically designated for children of enemy soldiers, institutions where the stigma of their parentage was the organizing principle of their care, and where the care itself was shaped by the contempt that Norwegian society had decided these children deserved. Some of these children were sent to psychiatric facilities, not because they had any psychiatric condition, but because the institution provided a mechanism for removing them from mainstream Norwegian life and keeping them where the majority did not have to see them or acknowledge what their existence meant. Many of these children grew up in a country that treated them as an embarrassment and a reproach simultaneously, as living evidence of something that Norwegian national pride would have preferred to suppress. They experienced bullying, exclusion, poverty, and a pervasive sense of being marked as different in a way that had no remedy available to them because the difference was their parentage and they had not chosen their parentage. One of them became famous, though for many years few people knew why. Annie Frid Lyngstad, one of the founding members of ABBA, the Swedish pop group that became one of the most successful musical acts in history, is the daughter of a Norwegian mother and a German soldier. She was born in 1945, shortly before the liberation. Her mother, Cindy Lyngstad, was a Tyskerpikkel. When the persecution of the Tyskerpiker began, Cindy fled Norway with her infant daughter and her own mother, escaping across the border to Sweden to avoid the camps and the deportation and the loss of citizenship. They were refugees in a neutral country because Norway had decided to punish Annie Frid's mother for falling in love. Cindy Lyngstad died in Sweden in 1947 at the age of 21, never having returned to her home country. Annie Frid was raised by her grandmother. She was 2 years old when her mother died. She became one of the most recognizable voices in the history of popular music, and the fact of her origins, the Norwegian girl, the German soldier, the flight to Sweden, the mother who died at 21 far from home, was not something that was widely known for decades. In 2000, the Norwegian government formally apologized to the Lebensborn children. In 2018, as noted, it apologized to their mothers. The Norwegian national broadcaster NRK produced documentaries. Historians wrote books. The country engaged eventually with what it had done to these women and children in the name of national purity, and the need to establish that Norway had been a nation of resistors rather than a nation that had, in significant numbers, fraternized with the occupiers. Across the border in the Netherlands, the liberation produced its own version of the same dynamics. In May 1945, as German forces surrendered and Dutch streets filled with celebrations, women accused of having had relationships with German soldiers were dragged from their homes, their heads shaved, marched through the streets while neighbors shouted and spat. In The Hague, photographs show a young woman who has been shaved and then tied to a lamppost, the crowd standing in a ring around her, watching. The photograph from the USHMM archives shows women in Grave, a town in the south of the Netherlands, their heads already shaved, waiting in a line to be marched through the streets for the public humiliation that follows the private one of losing your hair. Some Dutch women were arrested and held in the former concentration camp at Vught, which had been liberated and was now being used to hold Dutch collaborators, where they wore the clothing that had been worn by the camp's former prisoners and performed forced labor. In Belgium, the same scenes played out in Flemish and Walloon towns. Women shaved, paraded, jeered. Some who had had relationships with German soldiers were formally tried before liberation courts and sentenced, in some cases, to prison. Others faced only the mob, which required no evidence and offered no process. The country was attempting simultaneously to celebrate liberation and to reckon with 4 years of occupation that had involved significant numbers of its own citizens in forms of collaboration that ranged from the administrative necessity of keeping society functioning under enemy rule to active participation in the enforcement of German policy, including in some cases the persecution of Jewish Belgians. What all of these post-war reactions shared across France and Norway and the Netherlands and Belgium and Denmark, and wherever the German occupation had produced relationships between soldiers and local women, was the same displacement of collective guilt onto the most vulnerable and most visible targets. The women who were publicly shaved and paraded were visible. They had done something visible. A relationship is not a secret, the way that an economic deal with a German contractor is a secret, or that the quiet processing of administrative paperwork that facilitated the deportation of Jewish neighbors is a secret. The women's bodies had been the site of the relationship, which meant the evidence of the relationship was legible in ways that other forms of collaboration were not. The baby with the German father was evidence. The pregnancy was evidence. The relationship that people in the village had seen or heard about or gossiped about for 4 years was evidence. The women were caught. The men who had made money from the occupation, who had kept their businesses running and their lives stable, and their families fed by maintaining cooperative relationships with the occupying authority, were not caught in the same way. Their collaboration had no visible physical evidence. It was in ledgers and contracts and the private calculation of self-interest, not in their bodies. So the crowd went for what was visible. The crowd always goes for what is visible. There is one more dimension of this history that needs to be examined directly, because it is the dimension that complicates any simple moral accounting of what happened to these women. And that is the question of what some of them actually did. Not all of the women who were punished in France and Norway and the Netherlands were innocent of causing harm. Some of them were not. Some French women had genuinely denounced resistance members to the Gestapo. Some had provided intelligence about Jewish families hiding in their neighborhoods, information that was used to arrest those families and send them to the camps. Some had used their access to German authority to pursue personal vendettas against people they disliked, knowing that a denunciation could destroy a life. Some had participated enthusiastically in the social world of the occupation, attending parties, maintaining relationships with SS officers, benefiting from the privileges that proximity to power provided while their neighbors went hungry and hid in fear. These women existed, and they were, in moral terms, genuinely culpable for harm they had chosen to cause. The question is not whether their culpability was real. The question is whether the method of punishment chosen for them, the crowd in the square with the scissors, was a mechanism capable of making the distinctions that justice requires. It was not. The same scissors that cut the hair of the woman who had denounced a resistance fighter also cut the hair of the woman who had never denounced anyone, who had never done anything except fall in love at 19 with a young soldier from a country that had invaded hers, who could not have known at 19 that the liberation would bring a crowd with scissors, and the crowd would not ask her to explain the difference between her situation and anyone else's before it began. The stories of individual women from this period, collected by historians and journalists and documentary filmmakers across the decades since, are studies in the impossibility of clean moral categories when applied to the actual conditions of human life under occupation. There is the woman from Toulouse who became the neighborhood's pariah for 5 minutes of conversation through an open window. There is the farmer's wife from Normandy who provided eggs and milk to German soldiers who were billeted on her property, who had no mechanism for refusing them because they were armed men with the authority to take whatever they wanted, who was shaved and paraded when the Americans came because her neighbors remembered the eggs and the milk. There is the woman in Paris whose German boyfriend had protected her and her family from the worst of the occupation for 3 years, who had genuinely loved him and who genuinely mourned when he was killed, who was shaved because she went to his funeral. And there is the woman who picked up the phone and gave a name to the Gestapo and sent a family to Auschwitz. All of them got the scissors. The scissors cannot tell the difference. The Norwegian government said it in 2018. It said that Norwegian authorities had violated the fundamental principle that no citizen can be punished without trial or sentenced without law. It said that the women had been victims of undignified treatment. It said that for many of them, this had been just a teenage love. It said it was sorry. The women it was saying sorry to were mostly dead. The few who were still alive were in their 80s and 90s, which meant they had spent the majority of their lives carrying the mark of something done to them in the first months after liberation, when they were young women who had loved the wrong man, or been close to the wrong person, or been accused by the wrong neighbor. Norway's apology is meaningful as a statement of principle. It cannot undo what was done. France has never formally apologized. The head shaving of the femmes tondues is acknowledged in French historical scholarship, examined in museums, documented in exhibitions. It is not denied. But the official French position has not included the kind of formal governmental apology that Norway eventually issued. The women who were shaved in French villages in August 1944 have not received from their government the acknowledgement that what was done to them in the name of liberation was itself an injustice. In some towns across France, the women who were shaved never left. They stayed in the communities that had shaved them, grew old there, watched the people who had been in the crowd grow old around them. The scissors holders were not anonymous. Everyone in a small French village in 1944 knew everyone else. The woman who was dragged to the square knew whose hands held her wrists and whose hands held the scissors. She saw those hands for the rest of her life in the boulangerie, and the church, and the market. The community that had done this to her was the same community she continued to live in. The silence that settled over what had happened was not the silence of forgetting. It was the silence of people who knew what they had done and decided collectively that it was not going to be discussed. Some of the women left, changed their names, moved to other cities, rebuilt themselves somewhere that didn't know their history and couldn't recognize their faces without hair. Some succeeded. Some carried the weight of it to places where no one knew them and still couldn't put it down, because you cannot leave inside your own skull the memory of a crowd in a square and the sound of scissors and the cold of a shaved head in August sunlight. The 200,000 children born in France to French mothers and German fathers are now in their late 70s and early 80s, the generation that is passing. The 10,000 to 12,000 Lebensborn children born in Norway are aging alongside them. They are the last living evidence of this history, people whose existence is itself the document of what happened when the occupation produced relationships that the liberation then punished. Many of them have spent decades searching for information about their German fathers, for the record of who that man was and where he came from, and whether he survived the war, and whether he ever knew he had a child. Some have found answers, many have not. The records that would help them are in archives that are not always accessible or not always complete. The fathers in many cases are long dead. The trail ends in silence. The collective guilt that drove the épuration sauvage, the hunger to purge the shame of 4 years of occupation by identifying someone visible to punish, was not unique to France or Norway or any specific country. It was the universal human impulse to find, after catastrophe, someone who can serve as the receptacle for everything that everyone wants to believe was not their own fault. The women with the German soldiers were available for that purpose in a way that the men who had collaborated economically and administratively were not. Their bodies had been the site of the unforgivable act. Their hair was the price. What is extraordinary, looking back across 80 years at the photographs and the testimony and the scholarship that has accumulated around this episode in European history, is how long it took for anyone to formally acknowledge what should have been obvious from the beginning: that you cannot have justice without due process, that a crowd is not a court, that a pair of scissors is not a verdict, that the woman carrying her infant through the streets of Chartres with a shaved head and a brand on her forehead has not been found guilty of anything by any process that the word guilty can honestly be applied to. that the teenage girl in Norway who fell in love with a soldier from the country that invaded hers was not a war criminal, that the label German whore, applied by a society that had been occupied for 5 years and needed someone to blame for the shame of that occupation, does not tell you anything true about the person it is applied to. Norway said it in 2018. France has not yet said it. The women are mostly gone. The children of the women are aging. The photographs remain. The photograph of Simone Tussaud walking through the streets of Chartres with her daughter and her shaved head remains, published in Life magazine in 1944, present in the historical record ever since, one of the most reproduced images of the liberation of France. Most people who see it do not know her name. Most people who see it do not know that she denied the accusation that had been made against her. Most people who see it do not know what happened to her afterward, whether she rebuilt her life, whether her daughter grew up knowing what had been done to her mother, whether the infant in the photograph spent her childhood in the shadow of a crowd's verdict, delivered with scissors on a warm August afternoon. If you believe that the women in these photographs deserve to have their full stories told, not just the moment that was captured, but everything before it and after it. If you believe that the history of liberation includes this, that you cannot tell the truth about what the end of the occupation looked like without telling the truth about what it looked like for the women who were caught between the occupation and the liberation and punished by both, subscribe to this channel and share this video. This is the history that gets left out of the version we tell because it complicates the clean story of liberation and resistance and justice. The women with the shaved heads complicate it. The Lebensborn children living in Norwegian psychiatric institutions complicate it. The teenage girl deported from Norway to a destroyed Germany with a baby she wasn't allowed to raise in her own country complicates it. It should be complicated. The truth of this is complicated. And the people who lived it, the women who carried these stories in their bodies for the rest of their lives, deserve at minimum to have their complexity acknowledged by people who are still here to do it. The scissors came out in August 1944. In many ways, they never fully went away.